What would you do if your neighbor accused you of stealing something you didn't even know they had? I had no idea that a simple afternoon of mowing my lawn would turn into the start of a neighborhood war. The sun bore down, turning the air thick with humidity, making each breath feel like inhaling steam. Sweat clung to my back as I powered down the mower, wiping my forehead with my arm, when suddenly, I heard it. "You're stealing my water." The words cut through the air like a slap. I froze, turning to see Karen, my next-door neighbor, standing at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, her eyes burning with self-righteous fury. I blinked, caught completely off guard. "Excuse me?" She took a step forward, heels stabbing into the dirt, her face twisted in an expression of pure accusation. "Don't play dumb, Ethan. My water bill has been going through the roof, and I know it's because of you." I stared at her, dumbfounded. Stealing her water? I barely spoke to Karen, let alone had any reason to mess with her utilities. This was ridiculous. "Karen, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice even. But she wasn't listening. She scoffed, shaking her head as if she had already made up her mind. "Every time I check my bill, it's higher than it should be. My sprinklers aren't running more than usual, I haven't had any plumbing issues, so it has to be you. It's the only thing that makes sense." I opened my mouth to argue, but she was already turning away, mumbling something under her breath about calling the HOA and getting this handled. I stood there, completely stunned. Was this really happening? At first, I figured she'd cool off and realize how absurd her accusation was. But I underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. By the next morning, the rumors had already started. I stepped outside to get my newspaper and felt the unmistakable weight of watchful eyes from a few houses down. A neighbor walking their dog slowed, glanced at me, then quickly looked away. By noon, a formal complaint from the HOA landed in my mailbox. I ripped open the envelope, scanning the words, my stomach twisting. "Violation notice, unauthorized water use." My jaw tightened. This wasn't just Karen venting her frustrations anymore, she was dragging the entire neighborhood into her delusion. And the worst part? HOA was actually taking her side. I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. The HOA complaint sat on my kitchen table like a ticking time bomb. A formal violation notice for something I hadn't done. I knew Karen had a reputation for being difficult, but this? This was next-level insanity. Determined to clear my name, I decided to document everything. I took photos of my water meter, logged my usage, and even asked a few reasonable neighbors if they had experienced issues with their own water bills. No one else seemed to have a problem, just Karen. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept replaying her accusations in my mind. Why was she so sure it was me? Just as I was drifting into sleep, a sound pulled me back to consciousness. A faint rustling outside. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Maybe it was just a stray cat. Maybe I was just paranoid. Either way, I made a mental note to check in the morning. When the sun rose, I stepped outside, my mind still foggy from lack of sleep. But when I rounded the side of my house, my exhaustion turned to pure disbelief. A garden hose, my garden hose, was stretched across the lawn, snaking under the fence into Karen's yard. I took a step closer, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. The end of the hose was attached to my outdoor spigot, the valve turned just slightly open. Someone had set this up to make it look like I had been stealing water. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. I stormed over, yanking the hose free, my hands shaking with anger. I knew exactly what this was. Karen was trying to frame me. Before I could even catch my breath, movement caught my eye. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Duncan, one of Karen's closest friends, stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching me with suspicion. It was as if she had been waiting to see me get caught. And then, as if on cue, Karen herself appeared in her driveway, feigning shock. Well, she said, her voice dripping with false amusement. Caught red-handed, huh? My fists clenched. Are you serious right now? You put this here. Karen let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. Oh, please, Ethan. Do you really expect anyone to believe that? She turned to Mrs. Duncan, who was already nodding in agreement. First, you deny everything, and now you're trying to act like the victim? This wasn't just an accusation anymore. This was an ambush. Before I could respond, Karen pulled out her phone. I think the HOA is going to want to see this, she said, snapping a picture of the hose still lying on the ground. Oh, and maybe the water authority, too. Panic surged through me. She was trying to push this beyond just an HOA violation. She wanted official action taken against me. That was when I knew, I needed proof. I needed hard evidence that I wasn't just innocent, I was being set up. So that night, as the neighborhood buzzed with fresh gossip about Ethan the water thief, I set up a security camera facing my yard. If Karen tried anything again, this time, I'd be ready. And I didn't have to wait long. At 2:36 a.m., the camera caught Karen sneaking into my yard. She moved quickly, glancing around before crouching near my spigot. The footage was clear as day, her hands twisting the valve, setting up another staged theft. I watched the clip over and over, feeling a mix of triumph and rage. She had just sealed her own fate. By morning, I had sent the footage straight to the HOA. And when Karen answered the knock on her door that afternoon, expecting to see another compliant neighbor rallying to her cause, she found an HOA representative holding my footage in their hands. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, Karen's smirk faltered. Karen's smirk lasted all of 5 seconds before she realized what the HOA representative was holding. The footage. The undeniable proof that she had been sneaking onto my property, tampering with my spigot, and planting evidence to frame me. For the first time since this nightmare began, the tables had turned. I crossed my arms, watching as the representative handed her the printed screenshots. You want to explain this, Karen? She hesitated, her eyes darting between me and the HOA rep. This is ridiculous, she scoffed, waving the papers like they meant nothing. That footage doesn't prove anything. Maybe I was just checking because I suspected he was up to something. I let out a sharp laugh. Oh, really? You check my spigot at 2 in the morning? That's your story? The HOA rep sighed, clearly exhausted by the drama. Karen, we take vandalism and false accusations very seriously. This footage does not look good for you. I expected Karen to back down. To finally accept that she had lost. But instead, she did something I should have seen coming, she doubled down. I don't know what kind of cheap camera trick Ethan pulled, she said, her voice rising, but I know he's stealing my water. My bill has skyrocketed, and it sure as hell isn't because of me. Maybe he's doing something underground. Did anyone even check? I clenched my jaw. She had just gotten caught red-handed, and yet she was still trying to spin the narrative in her favor. Unbelievable. The HOA rep rubbed his temples. We'll need to conduct an official inspection before we can proceed with any further action. That was fine by me. Because I already knew the truth. And soon, Karen would, too. I wasted no time calling in a professional. The next morning, a plumber named Mike arrived, toolbox in hand, and got to work inspecting every inch of my water system. I watched as he checked the meter, tested the pressure, and examined the lines running along the property. After a thorough sweep, he stood up, dusting off his hands. Ethan, your system is clean. No leaks, no illegal taps. Everything's functioning properly. I exhaled, relieved, but I wasn't surprised. I already knew I wasn't the problem. But that still left one big question. So if it's not me, I asked, what's causing Karen's water bill to spike? Mike frowned, glancing toward the property line. Good question. But I might have an answer. He walked over to the edge of my yard, near Karen's fence, and crouched. His fingers brushed against the dirt, pressing down. And then, he turned to me, his face set in a grim expression. There's a significant pressure drop in her supply. And based on what I'm seeing, I'd bet good money that the leak is coming from her side. I froze. Could that really be it? Could Karen have been so determined to blame me that she ignored the real problem sitting in her own yard? Mike motioned for me to follow, stepping closer to the fence. And that's when I saw it, a sunken patch of soil, damp despite the summer heat. Looks like a busted underground pipe, Mike said. And if that's the case, she's been hemorrhaging water for a while. That would definitely explain the high bill. I wanted to laugh. After all this chaos, after weeks of being accused, framed, and dragged through the mud, the truth was so painfully simple. Karen's leak had been right in her own backyard the whole time. I turned to Mike. How do we prove this? He smirked. Oh, don't worry. I've got the tools for that. 30 minutes later, a small section of Karen's yard was dug up, revealing the undeniable truth, a cracked underground pipe, gushing water beneath the soil. Karen, who had been standing on her porch watching the whole thing unfold, went completely pale. I crossed my arms, savoring the moment. So, Karen, I said, my voice calm but firm, want to tell everyone again how I've been stealing your water? She opened her mouth, but for the first time since this all started, she had nothing to say. Karen stood frozen on her porch, her face drained of color as the undeniable truth lay exposed in her own backyard, a cracked underground pipe, gushing water beneath the soil. The very thing she had accused me of had been happening right under her nose the entire time. But I knew Karen. I knew her well enough to realize that even with the evidence staring her in the face, she wouldn't admit fault so easily. I turned to Mike, the plumber, who was already documenting the leak with his phone. This is what's been causing the spike in her water bill, right? I asked, loud enough for Karen and anyone else in earshot to hear. Mike nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. No doubt about it. The amount of water leaking from this pipe? That bill must have been climbing for months. And judging by the location of the damage, this isn't a natural break, it was likely caused by external interference. That got my attention. Interference? Mike stood, brushing the dirt off his knees. Yeah. Pipes don't just crack like this out of nowhere, especially not buried this deep. This looks like someone dug in this area recently. Might have hit the pipe by accident and either didn't notice, or didn't want to deal with it. A slow, creeping realization settled over me. I turned back toward Karen, whose hands were balled into fists at her sides. She wasn't saying anything, but her silence spoke volumes. I exhaled. Karen, did you have work done here recently? Her eyes flickered with something, panic, maybe, but she quickly masked it with that all-too-familiar bravado. What does that have to do with anything? She snapped. Mike, unfazed, walked closer to the exposed pipe, running a hand along the edges of the break. Actually, it has a lot to do with it. See these cuts in the soil? The way the dirt is packed in certain places? This wasn't a gradual leak, it was caused by something being installed here. He glanced over his shoulder at Karen. And I'm guessing you know exactly what that was. That's when I saw it, the way Karen's jaw tightened, the way she shifted her weight just slightly like she was preparing for an escape. And then it hit me. I turned toward her yard, toward the perfectly green, overly lush grass that covered a specific section of land. I had never thought much about it before, but now I saw it for what it was. You installed a sprinkler system here, I said, the words coming out slow, measured. Karen's expression flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Mike let out a low whistle. That explains it. You probably had someone come in to lay the pipes, and they must have hit the main water line in the process, and instead of fixing it, you just covered it up, huh? Karen's face flushed red, but not with embarrassment, *** with anger, ***, you don't know what you're talking about, she hissed. But we did. We knew exactly what had happened. She had illegally installed an underground sprinkler system without a permit, and in doing so, she had cracked her own water main. Instead of taking responsibility, instead of fixing the issue, she had gone out of her way to blame me. The realization made my stomach churn. All of this, every accusation, every HOA complaint, every rumor she had spread, had been nothing more than a cover-up. She knew she was at fault. She just didn't want to pay for it. The air was thick with tension. I could hear the distant hum of sprinklers from another yard, the chirping of birds overhead. But in that moment, all I could focus on was the rage bubbling inside me. Mike, still holding his phone, glanced at me. "I've got enough documentation here to file an official report. HOA's going to love this one." I almost laughed. After all the hell Karen had put me through, after weeks of being treated like a criminal, it was finally her turn to face the consequences. As if on cue, the HOA representative, who had been standing nearby watching the entire scene unfold, took out his clipboard and began writing a formal violation notice. He shook his head, muttering, "Unauthorized modifications, property damage, false accusations. This isn't looking good for you, Karen." Karen's nostrils flared. She took a step forward, fists clenched at her sides. "I was just trying to improve my property. What's the big deal? It's my yard." The HOA rep barely looked up. "And you did it without a permit, which is against HOA guidelines. Not to mention the false reports you made against Ethan." I didn't even need to say anything. The weight of her actions was crushing down on her. She knew it. I knew it. And the whole neighborhood would know it soon enough. She stood there, breathing hard, looking from me to the ruined patch of land where her buried secret had been unearthed. She had spent so much energy blaming me, so much effort trying to paint herself as the victim, and now? Now she was exposed. The HOA rep tore off the violation notice and handed it to her. "You'll be hearing from us soon." I expected her to argue, to throw out one last desperate attempt to make me the villain. But she didn't. Instead, she snatched the paper from his hand, spun on her heel, and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Mike let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Man. That lady's a piece of work." I exhaled, feeling a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Yeah. But at least now, everyone knows the truth. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe again. In the days that followed, the neighborhood slowly settled back into its usual rhythm, but the damage had already been done. Karen had spent weeks turning people against me, spreading lies, and manipulating the HOA, and even though the truth had finally come out, the scars of her actions remained. Some neighbors, the ones who had eagerly believed her, still gave me wary glances as if they weren't sure what to think. Others, realizing they had been fooled, offered awkward smiles but never outright admitted they had been wrong. That was the thing about false accusations. Even after proving your innocence, the stain never completely washes away. Karen, on the other hand, had become a ghost of her former self. Where she once strutted around the neighborhood, barking complaints and gathering followers, she now kept to herself. She had burned too many bridges. Her supporters had distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone who had been publicly exposed as a liar. The HOA, once so eager to hear her grievances, now regarded her as a problem tenant rather than a concerned homeowner. She had done this to herself. And yet, just when I thought it was over, she reached out. One evening, as I was tending to my front yard, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message. Karen wanted to meet. At first, I considered ignoring it. What could she possibly have to say that would make up for what she had done? But curiosity got the better of me, and the next afternoon, I found myself standing in front of her house once again. When she opened the door, she looked different, tired, hesitant, maybe even remorseful. She fidgeted with the edges of her sleeves, something I had never seen her do before. For a moment, there was silence between us, and then, in a voice much quieter than I had ever heard from her, she spoke. "I messed up." The words hung in the air, heavy with everything that had happened. She admitted that she had been embarrassed about her skyrocketing water bill, that she had panicked when she realized it was her own fault. Instead of owning up to it, she had taken the easy way out, blaming someone else. Me. She even admitted that when she started spreading the rumors, she knew deep down that she had no proof. I stood there, listening, waiting to feel something: anger, satisfaction, relief. But all I felt was tired. "I'm not expecting us to be friends," she added quickly, but I just wanted to say it. I nodded. That was all I could do. Accepting her apology wouldn't erase what she had put me through, but at the very least, she had finally said the words. Whether it was genuine or just another attempt at saving face, would never know for sure. But it didn't matter anymore. As I walked away, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. I had stood my ground, fought back against the lies, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. Karen had spent so much time trying to turn me into the villain, but she had ended up destroying her own credibility instead. The whole ordeal had left a mark on the neighborhood, a silent reminder of how quickly people turn on you when given the right story. The drama had faded, but the unease still lingered, a quiet rift that would take time to mend. Karen and I would never be friends, but at least now, we could coexist in the same space without another war breaking out. At the end of the day, I learned something valuable. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't fighting back with anger. It's letting the truth speak for itself. But it made me wonder, how many people out there have been falsely accused, blamed for something they didn't do, and never got the chance to clear their name? Have you ever had to defend yourself against a Karen? Or worse, an HOA siding with one? Share your experiences below. I bet some of you have stories even crazier than mine.